Good morning, AP Bio students. Welcome. As I told you, we are going to continue moving on with knowledge, even though we have covered what is going to happen with the AP Bio exam in the world of the COVID-19 winter. However they manage and however the schools are going to do the credits and manage things out. There is one thing I know. We are right in a key spot where, regardless of whether it's on the AP exam or not, this is knowledge you have to know. And I find it important because, if you do very well, say, although it's difficult to get, say you do get a 5, and schools kind of keep that 5 in the same realm where it has before, where you get to actually skip over early biology and stuff. There's going to be some stuff that you would have had here, especially with adaptation and evolution, that you should have. So, especially Hardy-Weinberg principle and some of the things that are associated with it. So we are going to keep on with our learning to give you that opportunity so that in a couple of years or next year, a couple of years, depending on junior, senior, sophomores, whatever it is, at what point you go on and move forward in college biology, this will have that opportunity for you to have the knowledge and not be behind. Okay. So, and this is what it is. We talk science here. We're not going to talk any religious theory and stuff like that. That's not what this is. This is a scientific view of how things adapt and change to their environment and may have changed over time, and how we have such a diverse species, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Going back to what I said at the beginning of the year, all organisms are looking for food, a place to be, their niche in society, a place to be, the ability to reproduce, offspring, and to feed and get all the energy and everything else. So we will do that. Other aspects of how things came to be or evolved are things you can study. One, I'm not going to claim to be an expert here, and I'm certainly not going to claim to have the knowledge to discuss it in any other realm. So, and that wouldn't be really in our nature. Our nature is to present this evidence and let you decide for yourself, besides just learning some scientific stuff. And as we go through this, although we're not in a class and we don't always have the readings, it is what it is. You can certainly go to the far end of the science spectrum where there are scientists who will talk about that anybody who doesn't believe in the science basis of evolution, and actually anybody who does believe in any type of religious belief is a wackadoodle. You go to the other extreme, certainly on the more religious side, you have those people that believe that everything is set and wrote from the Bible or any other book of philosophical, whatever your religion might be, and anybody who believes in science is a wackadoodle. And unfortunately, the truth is, for a lot of people, things aren't mutually exclusive, that they can live together. What people, the two things people most don't understand is Darwin was very devout religiously. It was a balance of science and religion for him. And the fact that he never used the word evolution at one point in his transcripts and in his publications. He looked at it as a descent with modification to explain how things adapt and change to their environment. And that, regardless of whether you're looking at a science view or any view or whatever, there is enough examples that we know that things adapt and change and evolve. The question that's always an argument is who's got the right mechanism for that to work. So anyhow, just putting that disclaimer out, because I don't, while I respect any questions you may have that may come from a non-scientific viewpoint, I'm not the you know, that's not a part of our discussion, and I'm not the one to answer. So anyhow, moving forward. Darwin himself noted that current species, and we'll get to more on Darwin, seem to be descendants of ancestral species from fossil record from his studies and everything else. So Darwin used the phrase descent with modification really as the idea that as things change, things have to adapt. And if you don't adapt, then your survival in the long term can be threatened. And he also viewed change and adaptation and evolution as both a process and a pattern. You know, so anyhow, that's kind of the background. Prior to getting into that, we got to help you with a little timeline and get an idea, because at points, while we're not going to study every one of these, nor would you actually need to know every one of these on a normal year AP Bio exam, but you can see here where Darwin was and published his Origin of Species and et cetera, all the influences that came before. Hutton talking about gradualism and how things take a whole lot of time. Malthus with his essay on the principle of population and stuff, which we'll address a little bit, but not a lot. Lamarck here, who, while his, as we're going to see, and it gets somewhat chuckled at, while his was the first to propose a mechanism of evolutionary change. It was off, as you will see, it was off. But the important part of Lamarck was he did, one, propose a mechanism for how we have so many species and the diversity that we have and how they could possibly adapt and change with changing environments. And he was one of the first to talk about that the world is much older, the earth is much older than we believe, and stuff like that. And then, of course, Darwin was also very interested in geology, and that'll come up as, you know, as he also experienced with earthquakes and saw big upheavals of rock, and then they were in the mountains, and you're seeing things in fossil record that were, you know, organisms of the sea up at the top of the mountain, and must have been a lot of earthquakes and disruption and moving things up and stuff. Anyhow, that kind of idea. So you get an idea that there is stuff here that's going to be talked about and in your reading, which is chapter 22, is, get the motorcycles out of the way there. But while it isn't direct stuff, it helps to the understanding. All right, so let's go ancient and then work our way up to Darwin, and a little bit of Darwin as we do this first day of some learning. You could go back to Aristotle, where most of the philosophers of the time had some suggestion or belief that life might have changed gradually over time and adapted and stuff like that. Aristotle, who had, as you well know the name and stuff, a very huge influence on Western science, actually believed that all species were fixed and came up with a scala naturae, which basically every organism has a spot on the rung of a ladder and scaled those organisms. Okay. Next we'll jump. Linnaeus is someone that you may not know the name, but you certainly know the term Homo sapiens and some of the others. He was a belief that the creator, whoever the creator was, designed each species for a specific purpose, and that's why you saw the variation in life. As in his view of finding that niche that every organism belonged, they were created to be there. The key for Linnaeus was he did, in all his observations, and then started classifying organisms and used and developed taxonomy or binomial nomenclature, the format for naming species, which is still used today, and really, with his grouping animals and everything else, fit very closely with Darwin's theory. Kind of, Darwin talked about the tree of life and how everything branched off and from its ancestors that it had prior. And so the two fit very well together, and binomial nomenclature still alive and well in how we classify organisms at this point. Okay, then there's Lamarck, and I shouldn't chuckle. Again, really the first that came up with the mechanism. Anyhow, Lamarck believed that things adapted and changed in evolution responded to the organism's, as he called it, sentiments interiors, their felt needs, their innate tendency to want to be perfect and complex. So there was this kind of belief that every organism innately strove to be perfect and more complex, more developed, more adapted. Okay? And a couple of principles by that mechanism for adaptations, the big ones were use and disuse. Body organs used extensively to cope with the environment become larger and stronger, while those that do not deteriorate and are gotten rid of. Okay. The second belief was that the inheritance of that acquired characteristics, so the modifications an organism acquired during its lifetime could be passed along to its offspring. So anything that I modified right now we've had genetics, and while there is that section of epigenetics and everything else, you know, one thing I'm sure we can all think about, or even without this knowledge agree upon, is that real adaptation and real change takes time. Takes time, and again, relative changes. I mean, you know, bacteria certainly, because of their reproduction rate and how many generations you can get in a day, it might seem like compared to us, they evolve rapidly. Compared to another bacteria, you know, it's like us. So it's all on scale. But that my desires and wishes and things that I do to make myself better, passing on to my offspring, not quite going to happen. And let me give you a further, here's why we were erroneous. But the great things that I mentioned. Evolution and adaptation is the best explanation for both the fossil record and the diversity of life. The Earth is much older than initially thought, and adaptation to that environment is really the product of things evolving, is adapting to the environment so you can survive. So let's talk about the most famous example of Lamarck. That would be that you can pass on those acquired characteristics is the giraffe. That the giraffe initially never had that real long neck that allows it to reach the leaves at the top of the tree. The belief was that over generations, you know, to get that food and to go towards that complexity and perfection that he wanted, that a giraffe would be stretching and reaching and stretching and reaching and wanting those higher up leaves that it couldn't quite get. And that could be acquired by, and so you could pass that along to your offspring, and your offspring's neck would be a little bit longer, and then that one would keep reaching and get longer. And so if you went over generations, then because of that desire to be perfect and that desire to reach and whatever, that you could get your neck to grow in that species, that the neck would grow just on that innate desire of the giraffe to stretch. And yeah. So, you know, it would be, you could take another example. You know, we have a history of distance running in our family, and that desire to get better, and that my father could have passed on his speed, his distance running abilities to me, and I pass them on to my son, and eventually we have the fastest man in the world in our family history. Anyhow, again, you look at it now and you kind of go, huh? But the whole point is the first one to really get people thinking in the process of not just saying what adapts, but how could they? And where is that mechanism? Okay. So let's then talk about Darwin. And we showed this on a timeline. Born about the same time Lamarck was publishing his theories, and really a couple big ideas out of his studies. Diverse forms of life have arisen by descent with modification from ancestral species. So they came from an ancestral species, and they have divided and become diverse as they have adapted to their environment over long periods of time and many generations. And then the mechanism that modification is natural selection, working again gradually. There's the gradualism of Hutton over long periods of time. Okay? So that, again, natural selection really comes down to those organisms with traits that are more beneficial in that environment to surviving that environment have a better possibility, better chance. It's not a guarantee, but a better chance of surviving and passing on their genetics. And so you would see them surviving well, and that being, say, a more dominant species or type or version or whatever, because they just had a greater chance to reproduce and a greater chance to pass along those beneficial genes. And that those who did not have the genetics that were beneficial to the environment, not saying they wouldn't reproduce by any means, they certainly could survive to reproduction, but their ability to survive to that point would be much less. Okay? So not that organisms can't survive when they're not ideally and most suited for that, but predominantly those with the genes that would survive, having a better chance would be there. Okay. So you can read in your book, or if you're really interested in reading about Darwin, there's plenty on the Beagle. There's a big picture thing in your textbook about his travels around and everything else. And really, it was a great scientific cataloging journey of observing fossils, comparing them to living species from the region, species in nearby regions. I told you he had an interest in geology, and so there was earthquake in Chile, and he was able to observe the uplift of the rocks, and being influenced by Lyell's principles of geology went beyond the fact, and so did Lamarck, that the earth was more than the 6,000 years old that it was believed to be, based on religious beliefs. Okay? Really kindled his question of species and adaptation and descent by modification on the Galapagos. Okay? Hypothesized that species from South America had colonized the Galapagos and speciated on the islands, and that's that comparison to nearby landforms and stuff. As nearby as South America is, it's the nearest idea. And again, Galapagos has, of course, you'll read and hear about Darwin's finches and everything else, but it was much more than just those birds, although they were a key component of it. Okay. All right, so there's that picture. I did put it in there from the book of all the travels and collections from Great Britain and stuff. Okay. So after the data, after collecting the data, assessing the observations, Darwin then perceived that adaptation to the environment and the origin of new species as closely related processes. Okay, again, these are time constraints, not that you're just adapting here and new species are something separate. It's that adaptation is helping create that new species. Okay? And then from studies made years after Darwin's, and here's come the finches, biologists have concluded that this is what happened to the Galapagos finches. There are almost 30 now different distinct finch species for varying reasons on the Galapagos Islands. And a lot of it comes down to, as you can see here, and this is a picture from your book, a variation in the beaks, which then varies the food that they can get, which then with 30 different ones allows everybody their little niche in finding food and consuming energy. Okay? And you can just see a few of the beaks there. Again, I just took these from your book. Those who have cactus versus insect versus seed eaters. Okay. So 1844, Darwin wrote an essay on natural selection as that mechanism of descent, but did not introduce the theory. Okay. Natural selection is a process in which individuals with favorable inherited traits or favorable inherited traits favorable inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. Then in about 1858, he got a manuscript because Darwin wasn't in a rush to do anything, but Alfred Russel Wallace, who we'll talk about, who's kind of the forgotten person in this whole thing, developed on his own basically the same theory, similar to Darwin's, but so then Darwin quickly finished and published the next year, and you hear about Darwin and you never hear about Wallace. So Darwin came up with basically three observations: the broad unity of life, but also the diversity. So that kind of balance between there's a connection, but there's a way that we've all split off, or all organisms have diversified. If I were to jump ahead and bring in genetics, which has done a whole lot, binomial nomenclature and setting up those groups and stuff as Linnaeus did, really hasn't changed much. What has happened with greater and greater genetic research and understanding is just a little shift in stuff. It's more just shifting things than it is changing things. So, without any genetic background and stuff, between Darwin and Linnaeus, the classification organization of similar organisms was quite well done. But going back to, if you think of the genetics, the unity of life, we're all from the same four bases. All organisms come from the same four bases. And yet the same four bases that, make up humans, and how that goes together and controls what we are, is different than that of the mustard plant, is different than that of the nematode. Although I believe, if I remember my genetics, we all have the same number of chromosomes. So you have the same number of chromosomes as a flatworm and a wild mustard plant. But somehow, most of the time, you are more advanced and intelligent. Not always. I believe sometimes you're sitting in the classroom and you are a mustard plant. Anyhow, but that gives you that idea that there's a unity, but also a diversity. And the match between organisms and their environment is how they've modified and adapted. Okay. Again, never used the word evolution. The phrase descent with modification summarized his perception of that unity of life. Phrase refers to the view that all organisms are related through descent from an ancestor that lived in the remote past, but then bringing in the diversity of the thing, adaptation allowed organisms to diverge and find their spot, their niche, their place to survive. Okay. In a Darwinian view, the history of life is like a tree with branches, which is kind of why it meshed so well with Linnaeus's hierarchy and binomial classification. I believe I stole from your book the original Darwin picture, not the original, but the original picture of the original. Yeah. Anyhow, and here what you get is just a table. We have looked at these with genetics before, when you did the blast, like you did murder by HIV. We looked at some of these trees and stuff like that. This is just an example from your book to highlight that descent by modification, that there was a common ancestor here. Back, you can't see the arrow, but there was a common ancestor for all these organisms back here. And then you can see the adaptations where they are in the taxonomy, the adaptations over time, even though they're all related, This is this descent by modification. Okay. So that's the idea. All right. Now, natural selection, there's the environmental forces working on organisms, better opportunity to reproduce. If you had favorable genes for that environment, traits and characteristics, whatever. There's also artificial selection, and that's been going on for millennia as the nomads started settling down and planting crops and domesticating animals and breeding the desired traits and breeding the plants. This isn't what, genetic plasmid insertion stuff, just specifically breeding the best and hardiest of your plants or animals or whatever. In that, domestication is an artificial selection. Okay? So that's part of that. Now, with natural selection, Darwin basically drew two inferences from two observations. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But let's look at this. Here's artificial selection. So here, this wild mustard plant, which may be the one that has the same number of chromosomes as you do, is the basically the ancestor or the offshoot, the artificial selection for all these other vegetables, right? If you select for just growing the stems, you'll get kohlrabi, which is delicious. If you're selecting for the flowers and the stems and guiding the growth that way, then you get broccoli, which I won't say delicious, but it's fine. If you were selecting for the buds that occur at the top, the apical buds, then eventually you can develop that into cabbage, and I like coleslaw. If you are, I don't know why anybody ever did this, but if you went for the axillary buds, the one on the side, cut off the tips and whatever, then eventually you are selecting and Brussels sprouts come out of that. And why somebody ever did that? Because they are nasty. If you select that plant and grow it for the leaves, then that developed into kale. So that's that artificial selection. Now, the basic two inferences and observations for Darwin. Number one, members of a population also all often vary in their inherited traits. Just look around in the classroom, we're not in. Okay. Look at the different versions of roses and flowers, and I don't care whether they're artificial or not. Look at the different versions of bugs and everything else. Okay. Observation two, all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and some of them fail to survive and reproduce. Okay. So what inferences do you draw from those? Individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and a higher probability of reproducing in a given environment will tend to leave more offspring than the other individuals. Okay. Like I said, doesn't negate those who aren't perfect, doesn't mean they can't reproduce, doesn't mean that everybody that has a higher probability reproduces. It just means that if they have that greater chance, they're going to have a tendency to leave more offspring and leave more of those traits. Inference two, that unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce, even the hardiest ones may not survive and reproduce, will lead to that accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. Okay. So you may, so you'll see that adaptation to the environment because of that, because not everybody survives, not everybody reproduces. You have a tendency to get more with the favorable things. Those favorable traits will collect and seem to dominate. Doesn't mean you won't always see some that have less. Maybe you won't see them at all, but that's all based on that unequal ability. Okay. As we mentioned in timeline, Darwin was also influenced by Malthus, who noted that the potential for human population to increase faster than food supplies and other resources, okay, which would feed into that survival ability. Okay. If some heritable traits are advantageous, these will accumulate in the population over time, and this will increase the frequency of individuals with those traits. So favor those with those traits. So that was the part that matched between organisms and their environment in his initial observations of unity, diversity, and that close match between adaptation and the mechanism that was there. Okay. Individuals with certain heritable characteristics survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Natural selection increases the adaptation of organisms to their environment over time. If an environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions and eventually a new species. And we'll talk about speciation, how that occurs. There's temporal and behavioral and all sorts of reasons why eventually, like all of Darwin's finches, besides beak growth and everything else, there was other reasons why they became species and diverged off into species that no longer necessarily can produce viable offspring and stuff because they've diversified so much. Okay. All right, and wrap it up with Ernst Mayr in the turn of the last century. As you can see, a while after Darwin and just passed away in this millennia, 2005, broke down Darwin's logic, okay, and did it in different ways. His first observation: all species have such a great potential fertility that their population size would increase exponentially if all the individuals reproduce successfully. You'd have massive population overload if everybody survived. Observation 2, populations tend to remain stable in size over time except for some seasonal fluctuations, weather that may cause things to die off, but then they bounce back. So this is his breaking down Darwin's logic to further stuff. 3, environmental resources are limited. And again, that goes back to, not everybody can have all they want all the time. Okay. So the inferences that came out of that, and they'll sound very similar to Darwin's couple of inferences and observations. Production of more individuals in the environment can support leads to a struggle for existence among individuals with only a fraction of the offspring surviving each generation. Okay. Makes sense. If you're going to produce more than the environment can hold, then there's got to be some selection mechanism. Okay. Observation 4, individuals of population vary extensively in their characteristics. No two individuals are exactly alike. Much of this variation is heritable. Thank you, Mendel. The next inference, survival in the struggle for existence is not random, but depends on part on the traits that the surviving individuals have. Those whose characteristics fit them best in the environment are more likely to leave offspring than less fit. Okay, makes sense. Next inference, this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to a gradual change in the population, with those favorable adaptations accumulating over generations. I think sounds basically is just taking Darwin's stuff and inferring and breaking it down. Okay, so here we'll wrap with these key ideas. Natural selection is this differential success in reproduction, and its product is adaptation of organisms to their environment. Okay. Natural selection occurs from the interaction between the environment and the variability in a population. Variations in a population arise by chance, but natural selection itself is not a chance phenomenon, since those environmental factors set definite criteria for reproductive success. Okay. And the last couple keynotes. Individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. Okay. Sorry, Lamarck, but individuals do not pass along and evolve over time. You do not. You may evolve and become a little different in a certain sense, but you certainly don't evolve and change, in the speciation and survival of your species extravaganza. You may just evolve as a nice human being. Okay. Natural selection can only increase or decrease those traits that vary in a population. They can't create new ones. Okay. Adaptations vary with different environments. We'll stop there, and then we'll pick it up with Wallace on our next one. Anyhow, so there you go. There's the quick, fast Darwin extravaganza. We got a few other things to do. We're working towards what's called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and Hardy-Weinberg principle that you can use to do calculations and stuff and do population genetics. Anyhow, ponder that, absorb that. We will talk to you soon. Stay safe.